Good afternoon. I had so many, today I had to answer about 20 times that what happened since yesterday. It is not to get the attention. I had a minor bruise and I'm just fine, thank you. The first, I think I'd like to comment to the organizers. That I found it fascinating and interesting to have yesterday my making of architecture in digital age, and back to back today the regeneration of the cities, the memory and identity. I found this subject very interesting, and in a way I think we're going to continue the last discussion we had yesterday. It's kind of continuation that we talked about the context, we talked about the collective realm and so forth. So this project actually leads to that realm. I think for our Hungarian friends that I'd like to introduce a little bit about the city of Gwangju. Gwangju in Chinese character literally means town of light. And light is associated with Gwangju quite in many ways. They have very strong, actually myself, I never been to Gwangju before this project. I found out the community has a very strong sense of community and very strong identity. And the three things typically they are very proud is resistance. They have resistance against the Yi dynasty and against Japanese the occupation, and then eventually the military dictatorship. So they have very strong sense of the pride and identity as a town of resistance. And also the very strong the art and culture there. There are a lot of the tradition in it. And another one is the gastronomy, that they are very proud of their food, which all puts together as a kind of the cultural and social identity of the town. But at the same time, actually the city of Gwangju is, as you see on the map, it's on the southwest corner of the peninsula. And in spite of they have very strong cultural and social identity of the place, the city itself is it's kind of almost left over from 60s on industrialization, and it doesn't have very strong public space. It doesn't have any strong character. To me, it felt like even though they have old 500-year-old town, city wall and so forth, physically it does not have any distinguished character itself. All it began in 2002. The government, I think, sponsored by Ministry of Culture and Ministry of Culture, Sports, the ministry, they established to build city of Gwangju as a hub of Asian culture. It's an economic plan. There's national economic plan was the main issue. And they have designated 7 districts, and ACC, Asia Cultural Center, was the focus of it, which put all together. It is not all realized. ACC is still built by now. It was, I think it was 2005, but we were selected by the international UIA-sponsored international competition. It has a program of the memorial and cultural exchange, and children's museum and archives, and a huge the exhibition and the theater. And total square meter is, site is 120 square meters. And it has a program of 140,000 square meters of the program. And because this is the place where actually the center of the complex is, the center portion is actually the old provincial government, and that's the place where the uprising took place and people died, and that's kind of sacred place for the city and for the competition. The idea was, instead of building high buildings around it, I decided to put underground. So 140,000 square meters of the program is underground, and the top becomes a park. And that was kind of guts of the competition scheme to start with. 1980, there was an incident of uprising against the military government, and over 200 people were killed. And at that time, it was an international event, and it was well known. And I think the city and the country wanted to remember that memory of it. And the right side, you see the, before we start the project, what it was. They have Rotary, where the uprising took place. There is a provincial government. And to me, city and streets and all of the area is as important as a memory to keep it, not just the one object, but the entire place could be an important element. And as a way of translating that into a physical scheme that leave the memorial building that's at the center of it, and by carving out average about 14 to 18 meters. So it's like a huge bathtub. And that becomes the center of it. And that begins to start establishing the relationship between the center and the periphery conditions. And that has been, I think, in both temples and palaces, in all the monumental buildings, center is established and periphery is supporting to that. And that relationship, and also that interaction between center of edge, that could be important element for this memorial, because this memorial has to relate to, since we are putting 140,000 square meters of cultural facilities, this has to be part of the memorial. It cannot be independent element. And in many ways, it is wonderful to have this future industry becomes relating to the past memory. Past and future is related. So this, the diagram shows, like palace has central piece of it and periphery of it. So center and edge relationship is kind of historical pattern of tradition of relating center to the edge. And by having that in the center and carving out 14 meters or around it, actually at that point height becomes almost 7-story high, and it's very much enhanced as a central piece. It is the piece of the center, and that facade is relating to the rest of the project. At the beginning, entire site has been flat, but I think I'll explain later the process of it. During that process, portion of it, that on this south portion of it, as well as north portion of it, just lifted a little bit because there's a lot of opposition. But at the end, I think, actually scheme was more improved than it is more improved. Initial idea basically was to put the building on the ground so that it does not overwhelm the existing the memorial itself. So the memory is commemorated by the location and by enhanced the spatial structure, and also the light itself. This park will have a light, and all those things together. But more than anything else, the idea is that Asian cultural complex, which is the futuristic, future-related cultural facility, being part of the memorial itself. Second point was that when I first got the competition kit and I looked at Google Map, the desire was to carve out the gray. It is so gray, and actually, even in Korea, public open space, comparing to other cities, the public open green space is very sparse in this specific in Gwangju, and this area has very limited amount of green space. So the idea was that somehow, if you can have open space park, that begins to relate to the memory of the democracy and accessibility, and that may be the easiest way or the best way to have whole memorial becomes part of place citizens can participate. And obviously, as a way of regenerating the area, that we had dreams of connecting Mount Mudung and open spaces so that it begins to generate open space network around it. The consequence is that there's 110,000 square meters of the open space created in the middle of the gray city. And also, as an urban design strategy, it is, the surrounding area is going to be very haphazard. There's no collective the regulation or agreement, and we don't know what is going to happen. In that case, I take the example of Central Park in New York, on the West Side. There's tremendous contrast between the built and unbuilt, and I think eventually building is going to build up. So in a strange way that open space itself is even more stronger urban form generator than building itself. And we have developed the Zakuba trees and the native trees and children's the playground and park, and at the end is a huge, about football field size, the lawn, which is sloping lawn for public events and so forth. So this becomes a park overall, and that has variety of the landscape and program areas. It also a historic wall, and the skylights itself in the park are the elements of the memorial and park itself. I have been occupied, I've been occupied with this idea about extrovert of introvert for a long time. And when I first left Korea, I think the most striking scene for me was that contrast between some of the Western cities or Western, the architecture and what Korea had. And I think it is especially true in case of the Gwangju. Gwangju has very strong cultural identity as a place, and it is very, actually in Korea, it's a socially as well that has been, it's eroding it, but the family and the school and the region, and there's layers of the enclosure of wall and boundary-oriented organization has been very strong. And I think it is changing it, and I think there's desire to change it, but it's an identity, and I think it can be valued. And this shows that courtyard equivalent one, which shows in section that because the exchange center is on the left, and then courtyard is the right, and the middle of it, it's carved out, and it is insulated from city sound and all the chaotic situation. It has in its own world, and it is pretty much, in my mind, close to conceptually more like old the Korean house, the house courtyard, where everything is connected through the courtyard. So courtyard becomes a connection point. It's more like a web. So the Asian Cultural Center will have these 5 different agencies. Those agencies is going to be connected through this courtyard and becomes the central space. At the same time, I think it is true, not just architecture, but just as the connections to outside. We're getting more into more and more. I think that connection and the web is going to be more and more important in our life now. But in this instance, because it's a major urban space, and for the town, we have made it many connections, and especially the central courtyard is about 600 meters, so even 12, 18 meters you can have very gentle slope. So service, emergency, all can go into it. That's a major connection. And interesting enough that many Asian cities, we have underground shopping malls and also subway station. We have 2 subway stations connecting here. That comes out to the level of actually Asian, the cultural plaza. So those connections, both linearly as well as perpendicular, is connecting the city and try to make seamless connection from the city coming into it. In that way, I call it extroverted, the courtyard. It's courtyard, which is defined by boundary, but it's extroverted by connections. And that shows main space. And the other element is light I mentioned already. The Gwangju is a town of light. I think even industry-wise is optical, the product and so forth. So Gwangju and light is quite interrelated. And I myself, personally, I was preoccupied with or interested in about exploring using rather non-architectural elements, but natural elements like light and forest. I actually started thinking about it back in the 90s, but I didn't mean that. I developed continuously, but incidentally at the end, it just turned out to be that my interest has been connected to that. And because it's underground, that at the edge of it, It's carved out so that light can go into it. I call it bamboo court because it's planted this bamboo arcade kind of space. And there are a lot of light chimneys in the middle. That becomes both light bringing into it and then light bringing our light out to the outside for view of it. And then occasionally we have light well. And more than anything else, the courtyard itself, actually it is a major means of bringing light to the other facilities. And this is an example of the bamboo court, which is average about 14 meter high, the slurry wall that's planted with bamboo, covered with arcade, which is similar to more about, that's not actually traditional, but the old buildings, but old walls, because topography was such that typically back of the house back of the building used to be against the high walls. Then I think the light itself could be also element of experience rather than just the functional reasons. And memory itself could encompass light as a major element. And that is what is built now, the light. I think it's also, to me, it's very important that there's a forest of light. It's the multiplicity of the lights, the quantity of it. I think it was the memorial. When actually the uprising took place, all the citizens and students all came together. It was not individual effort. And I think this light and cultural facilities and trees, all this combination, it's not directly saying that, okay, this statue is a memorial, but this is combination of everything, and in time one can experience. And 2005 was the competition, and that was, even now it is relevant, but I think we worked, because it's underground, we managed to cut about 40% of energy consumption because of the thickness of the cover on top and light and so forth. And because it is a public project, and because it is significant, the investment from government, and also I would assume that this project for this size will last not just our lifetime. And then how we deal with the time issues in architecture or urbanism, that especially in Korea, especially that because of politics, you build a building first before you have a program. So once you have definite programs, still, we know things are changing. I think it has been changed a lot even since 2005. Since 2005, in the area of technology, IT, tremendously changed. At the time, we had a great program to show how the IT can help the daily life, which I think is already our daily life. If you build that museum there, it will be obsolete by now. So things are changing. So when things are changing, and when we don't have a definite program, and how we deal with time was one of the preoccupation about this project as in general. One issue is that even though we have 5 agencies, that program was almost fictional programming that in 2005, it is kind of assumption that this could take place, but because of politics and because of organizational changes, it is going to change all the time. So one thing is that instead of each building, this is connected. So boundary is going to be fluid and moving. And programmatically, for example, performance and exhibition can be used vice versa for larger events. So those flexibility, and then courtyard, using the courtyard, we could make diagram that everything is connected directly like a web rather than grid or rather than ladder. And this is what has happened. It's more of programming that top is creation of exhibition and the performance, and then archive research, and the children's is slightly different because it has different requirements, but remaining is all connected, and courtyard becomes just like a courtyard house, that becomes a center where everything is connected. In terms of there are 2 kind of structure systems I used here. One is large, this one is 60 meter wide and 100 meter long space. And almost one could say anything can take place. And the idea was to build the city and build a building inside a building. Because for this size, as long as you provide the right context about the access and light and infrastructure, there's a great potential that things can change it. So we have one option, one area is that larger spaces to be developed later, or it can be changed later, transformed continuously that it can be used or built by somebody else. Thematic space itself also I use for the 24-meter precast, the span. I've been looking carefully about, especially this project, that if you look at, for example, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, they had incredible torturing growth, pain of growing, changing and putting things together this way. And a lot of cultural institutions about 20th century, they went through torturous process of growing. And they have to grow, they have to change it. On the contrary, 19th century industrial buildings, in my mind, quite a bit is tremendously well used. And to me, that's more beautiful art space than some of the 20th century museums. So the idea is that the structure itself has a long span. And again, the inside, another element can take place. And then the other area is that this one is courtyard, the Asian, the cultural plaza, which will have what we call scaffolding, where it can be refined, but it is an element that invites the other activities can take place. So it's more participatory, and in the long run, that can be changed. Actually, at this point, it is danger of losing it. They may take it down, but because the preservation is prevailed. I think the sense of identity can shift in various places, but idea at this point was that it can be fashion show there, it can be media wall, it can be art wall. The process was interesting too, and 2005, interestingly, I had two projects going on, one in Gwangju ACC. Another one was actually I was designing a graduate student housing at Harvard along Memorial Drive, and the same issue came up. It was time that Bilbao effect reached to the public, so the desire of having so-called signature buildings coming up was so strong that even though it is a completely different program, completely different location, because we're living in the time that public has certain knowledge. So I think opposition here and opposition there, I had to deal with two sides at the same time with different projects. The first issue was that, obviously that many people couldn't believe that their simple word was that, where is $700 million gone? It's all underground. They can't see anything. And I think for me, it took 46 presentations and 2 years. And my notion was that they called landmark, and landmark was an issue. Landmark issue was a big political issue. The landmark has, in different times, different ideologies and different meanings. And the landmark has to be our times. And the 2005 landmark should be not same as Eiffel Tower, where the material is steel and so forth, or it also, I think, culture has very different way of expressing it. Like the palaces in Korea, for example, is more about spaces and building inside. On the contrary, I mean, if you compare that with Eiffel Tower or the Empire State Building, which was quite often mentioned, it's exactly different. So our time and our place, we should invent our own landmark, not accepting or inviting other models. Anyhow, this issue was settled after 2 years that we came up with compromise, but not compromise, it was improvement, that lifting up portion of the building at the end, both sides of it, and it gives the kind of sign, from south and north signaling entrance, but that's the way we have settled it. And then there was another side of it was that from the beginning that there's two buildings, but one building was structurally weak, and also the structural quality such and also historically not as significant. So they agreed to take down the police station portion, which is right side, and leave on the provincial government. And then once construction started, some group of people recognized that that building is going, and they said we didn't know it. And then I think that became a huge issue about to take it down. But without taking it down, we couldn't have access. So that took another 2 years. And finally, we came up with some compromise. And actually, I'm going next week for another meeting for that issue about preservation, identity as a preservation, or identity as something of different nature as a memory. But overall, I think, as an architect, what I feel is that public space, that survives, and independent from what is going on and is changing inside and so forth. And this public space is being used, and I think I was thinking after all the process, I was thinking, what if I had built a building even 1 story high? It could have tremendous, the problem that, because building facade and all other issues. And that's the central portion is the building as a memorial. So we keep that identity both spatially and memory-wise. And then I was trying to leave, for example, this bridge is old road, so infrastructure, road and those experiences keep as much as possible, and the building there. And as a memory, place for memorial, it works for entire complex, including ACC down below. And programmatically and physically, I hope this works. Thank you.